Hello and welcome to the J Plus R Movie Podcast. A bit of a new format change. This time we're covering a film that has just come out. We aren't covering a film that came out like months ago or years ago or anything like that. Spoilers for the film. The most we will give is just brief general non-spoilery thoughts, but then we'll just go deep dive into spoilers. The basic plot setup of this film is that it's a sequel to John Wick Chapter 3, where John Wick was presumed dead by the High Table. This film kind of follows him in both his journey to get revenge on them, but also to gain freedom for himself. And along the way, we have both old characters like Winston and the Bowery King, but also new adversaries like Kane, another assassin, the main villain of the High Table. It's funny seeing how the series has evolved from the very first film, because the first film is quite a basic film when you describe it, but they were still beginning to show bigger world that it took place in. And now, as the films have gone on, they've shown more and more of that world, and the films have gotten progressively bigger and more epic. That culminates all in Chapter 4, which is a big, huge movie. Personally, I think it's really good. It's a very solid ending to this kind of story arc that they've had. Even though it is quite big and grand, it's also very dramatic and intimate in a sense. It does deliver on the action front, but I also do think that above all else, it's a solid conclusion, I think.
I think narratively it still works quite well once you figure out what the through line is. And for me, I didn't work it out immediately. When I started, I was like, all right, cool. The action's great. I'm not quite sure where the meat of it is thematically. And I was worried about that because I felt like in the last one, I found it a bit challenging to get to the thematic meat of the film. So watching this one, I was like, I was almost expecting a repeat. And then when it got to the point where it started connecting a couple of concepts together, started, going, this is what's behind it. It suddenly took the film into a higher gear for me, and I thought it was great. It really combined that blockbuster spectacle with some pretty decent personal stakes, subtle character work to it. I just thought made it work on more than just high octane action front. For me, it was thematically and scale wise quite engaging, so that was a treat.
Non-spoiler section over. Now let's go into spoilers. The way that the film starts off is so stark. It's so effective imagery wise, and when you think about it, there's actually a little bit of meaning to that imagery. I'm talking about the very first moments of the film.
Punching this board on a post, and it's just repeated over and over again. And then you've got the Bowery King coming through, basically delivering a Bible verse.
It catches your eye, imagery-wise. The intercutting is really good. But ultimately, I think, in hindsight, what I kind of think is that it sums up the point not only of the film, but also of the series. Constant punching and just constantly leaving a blood red stain is kind of meant to point out how John has kind of been spinning his wheels ever since the first film.
It kind of gets the message across that he's just moving forward against something that's never going to change, never going to move, and never going to stop.
Yeah, and that kind of sets up, I think, what's a bit of a subversion about this film, because what I went in expecting was that the film would basically be about him versus the High Table, but that's not really what happened. I mean, he is still against them, definitely, but it then transitions into the scene in the desert with him on horseback shooting at people, and then finding the elder who's a different elder. The elder basically just straight up says to him, they're just going to find a replacement. I'm a replacement and they'll replace me. It's basically him saying that his whole revenge mission is worthless, and John just shoots him anyway. It sums up the kind of point of the story, sets up the change that happens later on as well, where it becomes less about him getting revenge and more about him fighting for his own freedom.
The interesting thing about that was just how resigned John seemed at that point in the film. It was just like, they're just going to replace me. And he just goes, yeah. He knows, and he doesn't give a single flying fuck about it. He's just, I'm here to kill you. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and he does it. Almost a flaw of his character in that he kind of just is so determined that he's almost kind of stubborn. It's always understandable and sympathetic, but it's a thing that if you look at the first film, comes from an emotional place, but still, and in the second one, the whole reason why all of this stuff is happening is because at the end, he killed the main villain inside the hotel. Even in the end of the third film, what sets off the climax is that he refuses to kill Winston. And all of that stuff is kind of apparent from the opening, but I do think the rest of the film does back that up. But there's all of that stuff, right? This film is just so well directed and so atmospheric, and that's kind of what stuck out to me the most.
And Chad Stahelski did a great job. His character motivations are so clear in looks, and it's in looks as well. Because a lot of it's not really said, but you get a sense of relationships and how people relate to each other and emotions in the moment just off a couple of looks. And the action is what it is. It's wonderful as always. Get the sense of how exhausting it is, for how long they hold, and all that kind of thing. You do get these small moments where emotions and points get to just breathe and sit, and characters don't necessarily have to have huge reactions to them for them to land. I'm thinking specifically about the bit in the speedboat where they had this tombstone conversation, and John turns around and goes, "I want mine so loving husband," and they let that hang for a good 10 seconds as everyone's just looking at him. Like, okay, you realise that that's not how they expected him to want to be remembered, which was interesting. It's just not the image that they had, and you get that sense of shock, but also what's important to him as a person. Let's to just sit there.
I just want to have another example just to back up what you're saying about establishing stuff by visuals as well. The very first time we see Donnie Yen as Kane, his entire motivation is basically that he wants to protect his daughter. And that's basically established by just this scene of him watching her play a violin in public. He mentions his daughter quite a bit. The first establishing scene of that, I mean, first of all, there is an establishing scene of that. He doesn't just talk about his daughter. We do see his daughter briefly, but just visually by seeing him in public, watching his daughter play the violin.
Yeah, and you see him with a photo of her, and that's all. That's all there is. Got a photo with his kid. She's playing it. Oh, cool. That must be the kid growing up. It's done throughout the film, and then obviously you get a sense of scale and setup, like the way that he used low angles to get the scale of the stairs, for example, was really nice. And I've got a weakness for films set in Japan that have cherry blossoms blowing. I just
really. Yeah.
That just gets me going. So
Yeah.
seeing that get to be in this rooftop garden of the Osaka Continental with this wonderful discussion of death and how it works, and that's really all John Wick has left as he emerges from the shadows, basically a broken man in black. It was great. Like, just that scene, the atmosphere in that scene for me, I just loved it. It felt like a kind of showdown, but it was so quiet. It was all in dialogue, and it was great. Really remiss if I didn't talk about the climactic shootout, because it was just so Western inspired. It was beautiful.
The very last one, this is basically the climax of this part of the series, I would say, this major storyline. It all basically comes together in this classical, like Western, but also almost 1700s kind of duel where, like, you know, they take paces back, shoot with these like flintlock pistols as well. Such a classical form of duel. It almost indicates the history of this kind of secret assassin world. It may have existed somehow in some fashion all the way back in the 1700s or the 1800s, maybe.
Yeah, no, it does. It really gives you the idea of just the legacy and roots, and the idea of trying to challenge roots and how difficult that really is, which is quite interesting.
I think we should talk about the runtime as well, because this is not a fast-paced film by any means, and the direction kind of complements that. But for the most part, I would say this film kind of earns its length. What's good about it as well was that it does have a clear ending. It's not like you're watching a 3-hour film and then there's a cliffhanger to set up the other one. This is a complete film. It's a full-on epic movie. The way that it's sort of paced and edited, it very much allows scenes to breathe and play out fully.
Sure, it really does. Also, the way that the action plays as well, it's so long and so exhausting, but in like the best way possible. Like, you really get aligned with what's like John's mindset and the difficulty of the situation, and it helps you feel it so that everything then ramps up the tension even further, because you know just how exhausted it is to get to the point that they're at, and it's quite a beautiful thing.
Best example of that is the entire climax of the film basically takes place in 4 acts. You've got the car stuff, you've got house stuff, you've got the stairs, then you've got the final duel. A 4-act story within an already big movie. Third act of it, essentially the climax of the climax, well, almost the climax of the climax. A very big part is the steps. I would say that's the last big action sequence, and the duel bit is very different. It begins initially with you just thinking, oh, okay, John's gonna just have to walk up some steps. Maybe he's just gonna have to run up them. Honestly, when I was watching the film, I just thought that would just be like, I don't know, over and done with within like a minute or something, that he would just like start running and then he would get up the stairs. But then there's just all these people that just come along, and it all of a sudden becomes a battle and it becomes a gunfight. And then in probably one of the most like funny but also frustrating moments of the film, in a good way, John just gets thrown all the way back down the stairs. You know, just feel bad for him because he was able to fight off all these people, and then he just gets thrown all the way back down.
He's done like, all the work he's done so well, and then it's like none of it mattered. It's a great metaphor for his fight against the table, really.
Yeah, that is true. You even say it represents like prior films as well. In the third film, he was trying, he didn't really progress. Like he was still against them at the end of that film. He didn't resolve anything. Hell, even in the second one, he basically ended at a complete disadvantage as well. This is a good metaphor for how the series has been, in a sense.
A fantastic way to do it. It made the whole thing feel like Sisyphus trying to push the boulder up a mountain. I mean, if you think about it, the story of John Wick is basically a modern Sisyphus, which is quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Constantly trying to push the boulder up, but he can't do it. It keeps on repeating itself. He keeps on having to do it. You could even say that started during the first film as well. He was trying to deal with his own grief and couldn't do it. That was taken from him. I felt that the film had a lot of these great sequences, these very standout scenes that many of which I could mention. I think probably if I had to just pick one favorite, because that sequence is great, but if I had to pick one favorite, go with the club sequence. And this is hard because the first John Wick film had a really great club sequence, but this one I think manages to top it due to the fact that in concept it should be a bit of a simple side quest, but it ends up being this very, very intense, very euphoric sequence full of great fighting, full of great violence, character work as well, and good dialogue. It ends up then just being this very, very magnetic sequence that's also a fight scene with Scott Adkins in like a fat suit and stuff.
I think it was a good sequence. Like I really enjoyed Scott Adkins in the role. I think the bit at the table where they're playing cards with each other was great. Really, really good character work there, and the way they were talking pretty much about their motives and what they wanted out of the situation and who held the cards and what power really was in that situation was really interesting. One major issue I have with it, and it stops me from liking it as much as the sequence I'm going to mention, the background didn't react to a single thing happening 50 to 70% of the fight, and it took me right out of it.
I noticed it too, yeah.
Because like I really enjoyed the fight, it was great, but and it's one of the things that makes me really appreciate, good background work, which this film has in a lot of other places. It's just there. The fact that nobody was reacting to the violence made the violence just feel false. So the intensity for me was lost a little bit up until they started reacting, and then I was back in. Someone would have seen it, and there would have been a little bit more chaos. As something that the first John Wick had, two guys fighting, at least the people closest to them would be like, "What the fuck?" My favourite was the Osaka sequence because you had the challenge of the guys with the bulletproof armor, which had to get adapted to. You had the idea of like how close friendships were established. So I set up the fact that Kane had wanted nothing to do with this, and you get the idea that if there was a way that he could play a trick to get out of the situation, he absolutely would. You get the establishment of the idea that John might actually be seeking death more than anything else. And the fight sequence is probably one of the longest in the film, which is great. Also, has probably one of the best stunt falls I've ever seen, which is the escalator bit, because, oh my God, that was brutal.
There's a lot of amazing stunt work in this film. That's definitely one of them. I personally do think that Keanu's fall down the long steps was a bit more impressive, but you didn't really see that up close. But with this guy, you see it a bit more up close, don't you?
To be fair, the tracking shot of him falling down the stairs, man, I hope the pads held up, because Christ.
It's super ballsy for these guys to do.
It literalizes the Sisyphus metaphor that I find in these films, and I loved it personally.
The circus sequence was really good. I did prefer other ones. That section of the film is the only part where it starts taking a bit long to get going, because it is kind of a setup for the rest of the film. It's still very strong. That's the only part that I would have trimmed, and I think that was literally just because during some of the action I was like, oh yeah, okay, they're adding more, they're adding more in the first act of a long movie. But at the same time, it still really works, and there's still enough of the downtime between each of these sequences to where we have scenes that focus on John getting where he needs to go, conversing with Winston, the other assassin characters that we follow, scenes with them. All of that stuff is good. It means that then when we get to the action, it feels much more earned. It doesn't feel like we're just wasting time or anything. It almost feels like a film of climaxes.
Well, every act has a major action-based climax, and I love it. It really is storytelling through action. I think it nails it.
It's very hard to do, especially in a film that is nearly 3 hours. It's hard to do that without just falling into potential padding. Some of the strongest moments are these moments that occur during these action scenes, like, for example, the moment where John saves Mr. Nobody's dog as well. It's really funny that there's a character called Mr. Nobody in this film as well. That is pretty hilarious. Yeah. It's quite an important moment. And same goes for, again, that entire casino bit, because obviously in that moment, this is him doing stuff to be able to get to that jewel, which then is the point of the film. Even like the Osaka stuff, like, again, it does have that character background. And especially, it's kind of important to almost throw John off of the whole kill 'em all revenge spree.
That's
Yeah.
where the switch sort of happens for him.
Yeah, because it's made very clear his allies are going to die in the process too. He's going to get a lot of innocent people killed if he keeps on doing this, because he's increasing the danger and he's becoming the target. That's putting loads of other people in danger. And that even sets up the daughter of the manager of the Osaka, how she kind of gets this side plot that then in the post-credit scene gets a bit of a resolution as well.
I think she was kind of the representative of both the consequences of what John does and first trigger for the change in him. Also, she's a representative of the cycle of violence just continuing itself over and over.
Also, to make clear that the character of Kane himself, as much as we're kind of able to see him as this honourable figure, there are also consequences to what he does as well. We're able to see him as both this likable, honourable guy, but also this guy who does do bad things, and that's a consequence of the bad stuff that he does, because he basically kills her father. In the post-credit scene, we see she's basically coming after him, mainly for that. I think also to avenge John as well.
And since you mentioned it, let's talk about it. Bold decision to kill John.
I do want to bring up Sharon's death at the opening.
Yeah.
Both of these parts of the film, like, they were very
shocking,
jarringly shocking. In the A, I wasn't expecting them, and B, they kind of had this emotional impact and this sort of sadness that I wasn't really expecting from this film. Because I did know that this was probably going to be like a wrap up and a farewell, but these were just turns that I just did not expect. And to start off with the Sharon bit, obviously Lance Reddick's actual passing did play into that. I did make it a little bit more uncomfortable than maybe it was intended. Take that out, you look at it, he was a cool character and he served his purpose pretty well in the other films. Even in Chapter 3, he showed that he could take on guys in a fight. So he was kind of tough in his own way, and he was always cool. So when he dies at the beginning, it is quite...
It's a big move. It's, again, not something that's necessarily expected, and it's just quite vicious, you know. Other thing, it immediately makes you hate the villain. Also, given the actor died like a week before the film's release, I hope you hate him that little bit more. Ultimately, it's played really, really well by Lance Reddick as well. Shock of it, and it just seals in how awesome of a character he was, because the whole time he's just there like, he's pretty much gone to Winston, you were my best friend, man. As he's dying, he's still providing that bit of comfort where you're just like, oh god, this is such a great character.
It's that sort of writing trick that you do sometimes get where, like, you kill off a returning character, especially like a returning side character, to kind of up the stakes, and it doesn't feel that forced. And also it
doesn't feel like they picked a random guy out of the background to be like, yeah, this will add stakes. It felt like an actual death with weight, and it also made sense. It gave Winston good motivation for the film.
Totally, completely. Yeah, there is John dying at the end as well. I have to say, as clear cut as that sequence to me is, I know that there's probably going to be some people who walk out this film and think that he didn't die.
Part of that is that there's meant to be a John Wick 5.
There was a fifth one in development. That is probably what is making some people think, oh, he's not dead at the end. But that being said, the way that it is in this film does seem particularly final. We'll respect them more if they choose to just kind of leave it at this. The ending on its own, I thought, was very, very touching and sad and fitting as well, because of what we've been talking about. And I think also it shows that John isn't just gaining freedom from the actual situation, but he's gaining freedom from the hellish life that he's lived.
It's almost like he's being released to go back to being that loving husband that he clearly preferred to be from the first one.
And the final exchanges of the film is Barry King and Winston in his grave saying, "You think he's in heaven or hell?" And Winston just says, "Who knows?" And what's funny is that I feel like his life was hell and he's probably going to heaven.
I think it was just that John was one of those people you just couldn't figure out. I think that's something that's quite true for the film, because as much as he was necessarily all about revenge, you then see how important his connections were to him. You see more of the man than you do in any other film. It's the one where you get both the most vicious side of John and the most human side of John all at once, all delivered with almost this very monosyllabic kind of tone, which makes it tough to distinguish, but it's also made really clear. I think it's just a great performance of trauma and the effect of that on someone, like constant violence and trauma. And I think him finally escaping that cycle, and then getting to define how he's remembered for eternity, I think that's quite a nice thing, because he spends much in these films being defined by other people, introduced by other people, spoken about by other people. And this is a film where he gets to be who he wants to be and chooses to be. I think that's quite an interesting thing about the ending that I quite like.
So that's kind of the journey of this film, is that it's a journey to become free. And that's what he becomes at the end. He, in some ways, he's free from literally everything. What he chooses to remember in his last moments is his wife. It's not about being paid to kill people. It's not about having to kill people. It's about the independent life that he lived outside of all of that and the romance that he had. That is a really solid, good way to finish off the story. It does have an emotional punch to it.
A very similar energy to. Have you seen the anime Cowboy Bebop?
I know what ending you're talking about. I've seen some of it.
Yeah, it gives me a very similar kind of energy to the end of that series. It kind of works in the same way. But like you said, people theorize if he survived or not. But as who knows, who cares? What does it matter? That story ended with him thinking about his wife, getting his freedom from the table, and overcoming the worst parts of his nature, which is what this film's been about.
It's like helping Winston getting back his hotel. And I feel like Winston and the Barry King are basically the only family that he's ever had. They felt almost like dueling father figures. Winston's this more ambiguous figure who's had to play by the rules, but despite that, he's always remained on John's side. Actually, I'd say the Barry King is more like his uncle, almost like the uncle who comes in to like help him out and stuff when he needs help. So there is a bit of resonance to seeing just those two at his funeral.
Yeah, it's all the family he's really got left, so it makes it quite interesting.
Let's also just briefly talk about the supporting cast as well, because they kind of back the film up quite well. Obviously, like to many people, the standout character is going to be Kane, the character that Donnie Yen plays. And what's quite cool about Donnie Yen's acting in this film is that it's kind of similar to the character that he played in Rogue One, but thankfully he plays it very differently. He's still playing a blind warrior, but he plays him differently too in that film.
And you get this sense of reluctance, at the same time just desperation and care, and it's quite an interesting balance to walk. But I think he does it really, really well. Clancy Brown was great. Clancy Brown is always great, but
he's kind of a redeemable villain as well, isn't he? Especially by the end of it. Even early on, you get the sense that he's really disgusted with Skarsgård.
You get the idea that he's just so done with all this, but he's also very much the table's man. So you kind of get the sense that he's literally just very much business-like. He doesn't actually care that much about what's happening, other than dealing with the issue in the best way possible. You get the idea he doesn't really have any sort of personal stake in this. The Marquise is just repulsive, and I think that really helps. Quite entertaining. It kind of embodies the worst parts about the table, the appetite for violence, the viciousness, the self-centeredness, the focus on wealth and resource above all else. But Skarsgård plays him very well. It's almost like this very petulant child sort of thing.
One who has all the power. He breaks the rules all the time. Doesn't play fair or honorably, you know, especially with the duel. He sends all these guys after John. He basically just wants John to lose before he can even actually do this thing that he has earned quite rightfully. But makes the scene where he gets killed so satisfying. It might be the strongest and most satisfying villain death in any of these films, even more so than the guy who actually killed his dog in the first one.
No, I'd agree with that. This moment was big. It was a pretty fun twist on the situation. He failed to observe the rules, but the rules were still in play.
The rules also got broken by John, which is kind of in some ways fair because the villain was breaking the rules anyway.
I don't think he necessarily broke them. He just let himself get shot.
Which could have caused his death. It's like he was willing to do that just to win in the way that he was trying to win in gaining freedom way. The one thing I do want to mention as well is that I did initially, during the third act of the film, I did have the issue of the fact that John seemed to endure more than he ever could in any of the films. And he's definitely been made of iron. The climax of this film, I was thinking, he's surviving so much. I don't know how he's surviving this. Starting to be a little bit too much for me. But, and in some ways, that's why I like that he dies, because all those wounds do catch up. The gut shot, I think, was just the cementing of that.
Cemented the importance of consequences. Yes, there's a physical consequence to doing all of this, but it will result in a bad time, and that's something that John eventually even had to face. It's like his sins catching up to him, which is quite interesting, because the whole series has been about... I mean, John, if you think about it, has been introduced as like a villain would be for the whole series. To see that almost catch up with him in a moment of victory is quite fitting, but it's tragic, and it really just created a really complex emotional payoff to his death, which I think the series needed. I don't want to get about like a horror movie villain. I think it's a big part of the reason why he feels so dangerous, and also again why you don't see the deaths coming, because you don't even think it's possible.
So he seems like more of a force than a man. But I do like the fact that, no, I was pointing out obviously that like he was surviving quite a lot. He still is clearly injured throughout most of the film. He's still clearly taking hits. So that does help him. And he's also not always on top of things as well, which is quite beneficial to, it makes the badass moments even more impactful, I feel.
Overcoming great difficulty that could
Yeah.
actually take him out, and it adds stakes to it, because I've seen plenty of action movies where it feels like the main lead is just unkillable.
Again, it was bordering on that for me, but thankfully saved. It is basically the end of a story, and I think it works very well as such. It's not necessarily what you'd expect. Still found it to be very effective, surprisingly thoughtful upon further reflection, fun still entertaining, not too depressing. Still, it carried with it an emotional way, and I felt I really respected that.
I think it delivered on some of the best action I've seen in an American film. It was emotionally resonant. It delivered its themes well. It was in keeping with the other films. It pushed things to the limit, ended well, and at least for this film, committed to it.
I kind of hope they do, but this has been a very strong, consistent series. So I wouldn't be very interested to see what they do next. But this just kind of ends it. If it was really good, would recommend it. You obviously would as well, Jack.
Well, I'd recommend John Wick 4 for sure.
That's going to be it. I have not decided on what my next video is going to be, but I will make sure to post one next month. See ya.